Eric, maybe one place to start with you. I know when I'm having a tough day, like what is going on in the world? Why are we making some of these decisions? Why is the policy world the way it is? I call you and I say, Eric, make me feel better. Tell me the world is more rational and more thoughtful, and that we're going to pull away from some of these things that aren't good ideas. Let's start with that. Let's say all of us just called you. You're in your office in New York. How are you making sense of the world today? What has you optimistic? Where do you see things that feel better and more thoughtful and maybe more wonkish and less combative? It's a heck of a time on the planet these days.
Well, first of all, Maynard, thank you. Senator, thank you for that overly kind introduction, because I can tell you not even half of that, maybe 1% we could believe. I would say I really need my wife here to have heard all that.
There's a video. We're going to send it to her.
Right. But I tell you, it's great to be in Austin. It's a funny story. You know, when I was leader, I would go around and try and raise money for, in the political world, and I'd come here when we'd have candidates trying to run in this county, and always a little bit difficult in Travis County and the rest. And I remember having a privilege of speaking at UT, and then I would go to College Station the day after. And being a Virginian, I get, the Wahoos and the Hokies, but it was trying to get that implanted in my brain about hook 'em horns and gig 'em Aggies. And I can tell you, I almost got it wrong when I was in College Station and had to catch myself. But nonetheless, it's great to be here. Maynard, the world is great when you wake up in Austin and when you wake up in Texas. So I will say that. I see my partner from Moelis, Steve Trauber, who heads up our Houston office, and we just it's always about optimism. And when Senator Hutchinson talked about energy is Texas and Texas is energy, I do think it is the world force comes out of here. So thank you. At Moelis now, I do a lot of traveling. I just got back from Asia. We'll stay on the road pretty much through the end of the year with our clients. And it is amazing, though, when you think about what's gone on over the last, 6, 8, 12 weeks. We've had globally, from a geopolitical standpoint, you've had these shocks in elections. I mean, the UK, the EU, Germany had provincial elections just last week. India had an election that didn't come out the way it was supposed to or expected. Obviously, we're going through an epic one here. And all the while, in the financial markets, we've seen this incredible volatility pick up, too, where you've seen a rotation out of what was driving the S&P for the last, I don't know how many years, the Mag 7, into yet the Russell 2000. So you put all that together, and it's amazing that we are still, trucking right along. And, there's a great quote by, of all things, Vladimir Lenin. I think as those of us who, certainly Macomb School, and those of us who believe we are free market capitalists, I hate to quote somebody like that, but he did have a great quote that's applicable. He said, there are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen. And I do think that's sort of where we are, Maynard, but I am very optimistic. I'm very optimistic.
So you said two things in there I wanted to latch onto, and one is just this base level of volatility that seems to be, it's in our markets, it's in our politics, it's in the geopolitics. It doesn't seem to have a home. It's in many countries. Is there any particular reason that you think we have that kind of volatility? Is it the way information flows so fast now? What would be your theory about this volatility?
So I think this volatility, again, in the markets as well as geopolitically, is brought about by, I think, like three mega trends. And you could call them the three Ds. One is deglobalization. Secondly, decarbonization. And then I would say third is demography. And these forces have come to bear. And if you look at any of these countries, you look at China, again, just having it made a big impact on me. I hadn't been there in 5 years since before COVID. And you think about those three megatrends there, all of which are impacting, now the second largest country in the world, second largest economy in the world. Each one of those. And so I do think, from a decarbonization standpoint, obviously this state is in the middle of it. It's amazing, but I do think it's testament to our country in Texas that not only is it the capital of the conventional energy world, but it also now has assumed a place in preeminence in the new energy world.
So that's an interesting question, which is if you're in China, which you just were, I think we have a feeling here in Texas that not everybody has energy policy correct around the world. Some really don't have it right. But we have a little bit of hey, Texas kind of sort of has it right. I mean, it has a balance. There's things we need to improve. But relative to the rest of the world, is that the way the rest of the world sees Texas? Or are we kind of inflating our own view of ourselves?
Well, I wish the rest of the world, and whatever that would mean in the markets or just the populace, I wish they would understand what it is that makes Texas and America what it is. Instead, though, you mentioned social media and the sort of the digital world that we all live in now. I just think the perception is so skewed because the senator mentioned the chaos that has descended upon our nation's capital. And it's just, to me, unfortunately, that is the projection of America. But I do think in the industry, and I spent a lot of time in the other sort of energy capital of the world in the Gulf, at the country's Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. Is no question that what is driving those companies are individuals of extreme talent that come out of Texas schools. And there's a real dedication and reverence, if you will, for Texas. And in just the most ironic way, too, those Saudi executives that run that world company, they have a reverence for Texas football. So it's amazing.
It's a good year to have
right?
That. Yeah.
I say as my daughter is a Wolverine, so yeah, she's still getting over last week. Yeah.
Well, two questions, because the senator referenced it in your background. You were part of the wonkish group that was thinking hard about real solutions. That was you were a policy-focused person. And I think if there's a frustration that people have today is the lack of, there's so much noise, the lack of focus on real questions, real answers, real policies, and why are we wasting time on some of this other stuff? And it's crowding out the policy discussion. Do you think we're on a path where we're just not going to, that's just the way we live now? Or can the wonkish group sort of reassert itself and say, hey, it's time to get out your yellow pad, we're going to problem solve and stop some of the noise?
So I have a theory about why we are seemingly in such chaos, and it's chaos I think that ultimately will be manageable. Here's my optimism. But I do think that, in our country, we have lost a governing consensus. And it's not without historical precedent. Because if you go back to at the end of the Civil War in our country, there are periods of time, 35, 40 years, in which there were governing consensus. And that I meant like economically, from a social standpoint. And we had a breakdown of that at some point, probably after the great financial crisis, I believe. And the last consensus that we had really grew out of the failure of the prior one, which was during the 1970s. And that was a time which many of you weren't even here on this earth. But it was a time in which my party's president, President Nixon, had, he obviously left office in disgrace, but, he really was part of that consensus that was a bipartisan, almost Keynesian-type consensus in a post-World War. The government played a role in just about everything, in setting prices, setting rates, setting, airplane routes. I mean, it was in train routes and telephone rates and the whole thing. And and the theory was, as long as we have Washington priming the pump from the fiscal side, you'd have enough demand that you'd always have growth. But what happened then is stagflation then descended upon the country. Jimmy Carter, those days of the malaise, I think it was disproven right there that that consensus wasn't working. So along came Ronald Reagan, along with, there were plenty of other sort of think tanks that were set up at the time in Washington that really sort of was the advent of supply-side economics. And it was a deregulatory age. It was the age to move out the heavy hand of government industrial policy, allow the private sector to flourish, lower taxes, lower regulation. And even the other side came to realize that because the Republicans began to dominate politically in states like this, in states like my state that hadn't been Republican since the Civil War. So even Bill Clinton, in one of the State of the Union addresses during his tenure, he went in front of the nation and said the era of big government is over. And that was our consensus. Somewhere along the way, whether it was China's ascension into the WTO, whether it was the Iraq War, whether it was NAFTA, whether it was the great financial crisis, the country has lost confidence. So that, to me, is the theory of why things are so chaotic. And you ask, are we going to get back together on a consensus? And I believe, yes, we will. It's just we're in this transition period.
So just on the confidence question, is that a loss of confidence in the country and its institutions or its direction, or a loss of confidence in leadership?
Well, I do think that Washington, sort of ends up in stalemate when we don't have broad consensus. And leadership is the essential ingredient to start with trying to arrive at that consensus. I also believe, though I mentioned those think tanks, it stems from ideas, and it stems from where is it that we're going to find a winning formula to get our country back on a path. Now, next year, in 2025, there will be a fiscal Super Bowl in Washington, and it will force the clash of some of this when we sit here and think about resolving the expiration of a lot of the tax cuts that are in place, reform of the tax code, dealing with the fiscal situation. I believe it may provide us with the underpinnings for arriving at some kind of consensus.
So do you find it amazing? We don't have to talk about the debate, except maybe to say the national debt was not brought up. Okay, maybe you can understand why. But the expiration of the Trump tax cuts and whether or not we renew them or let them expire, that's a huge issue, and that's just a piece of that casserole. Were you amazed watching that debate that neither one of those topics are brought up?
Again, the senator and I have the scars to show for it. I was in public office for almost 25 years. Started at the state level at 27 years old, and was very privileged and lucky to ride a wave. And so, no, I'm not surprised. I don't think, unfortunately, that people wake up this morning here in Austin or elsewhere thinking about the amount of unfunded liabilities at the federal level, or the rate of tax and how much percentage of government spend of GDP should we have, unfortunately. But the fact that there's no policy discussion whatsoever is a little bit concerning. But I do think, we'll have to deal with it because it will be meaningful to working people in this country if there isn't action taken. So there will have to be a coming together next year, and I'm very interested to see how it will all play out. I know our clients are very interested, very, very focused on specific provisions.
So you mentioned your clients, and maybe we could talk a little bit about decision making as you see it around the world, and you sort of get the impression with all this volatility and all these things we've talked about, all these trends decarbonization, deglobalization, et cetera, that large organizations, maybe private ones, that can think long term, whether they are countries or companies, those types of organizations are advantaged right now to kind of calm down, look through the noise, and plan for the future. And the public ones, you know, that are like I suppose the political system is the most exposed to volatility. They are not making good decisions. Is that a decent way to think about who's making good decisions right now and who's not?
You know, I do think we are, in a way, handicapped in the political world or the governmental world when you are a democracy. Because you could say, I say in a way, because somehow at the end it all works. But you are right. The imperative is to answer to the electorate every 2 years, essentially, in our country, if not every 4 on the national level, but you've got the Senate and the House every 2 years, a third of the Senate at least. So in a way, you are correct. There is short-term thinking, and how do we meet the approval of the voters? But I sit here, again, having come from China, and to see their government, right? They don't have that imperative, obviously. I hadn't been there in 5 years, and it's a big change. And they theoretically have, you know, the Communist Party and their government have the ability to think long term, but they lack the dynamic that we've got and the dynamism that is inherent in a democracy. And I think very unique to the United States, because it really, if you go back to our founding, it was that vision. You know, it's really something. If you think about, we are a country that has a government of the people whose people really don't trust that government, right? And now we also are this tremendous economic power, the largest in the world, and a military to match. A lot of issues there too, but a military to match, where a country that doesn't really want to be involved in international affairs. So there's all this tension. But the default in these founding documents is based upon individual rights, liberty, and the private sector, which is why power is so dispersed. It's why Austin, Tallahassee, Sacramento have so much power under our system, because people didn't want the concentration of that power in the central government. It is that sort of long-term vision that we're very blessed with that I think will make it, to your point, that be able to think a little bit longer term.
So we'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit more about China. And, you know, one thing you mentioned, these periods of consensus in America, and one of them was the Cold War, and it was because we had an enemy. Every morning you woke up knowing we have an enemy. China seems to be becoming the new Soviet Union. It's the one thing that, I mean, there's like 5 things that Democrats and Republicans seem to agree on, and the China threat seems to be one. Is that going to bring us back together? Should we have that fear? And what do you find in China? Are they viewing us similar to the way that we're viewing them?
Okay, so, you know, just when I approached that question before I went there, I've always felt like, and Steve knows, we've got plenty of clients who are multinationals that they look at that market, and, you know, it's 20% of the world's population. People want to do business with that, you know, and obviously they know how to make things in China. They know how to copy things. They know how to steal things. They knew a lot, so people want to be able to, you know, allow capital to flow to that efficient use. So that's sort of when I went in thinking, when I went there, hey, well, how do you figure this out? And you're right. In Washington, there is very few bipartisan issues. That one is straight up number one, and it's almost toxic. The minute you let up off the gas of going tough and being hawkish on China, there's a political vulnerability.
Can I just ask you a question right there? So is that unanimity around the view of China, is it because politically that's just where you got to be, or is it because from a policy standpoint it's a legitimate concern?
I saw it, and that gets to my trip there. I saw it. I'll tell you a little anecdote where when you ask, is there something there? Do they think this way about us? And should we really be concerned? Two anecdotes. One morning when I was in Beijing, I was having breakfast with the founder of one of these companies that is like a $50 billion market cap company. It was started like in 2010, and it is like famous for basically copying IP and just it's sort of the the lookalike brands, consumer products. And they also just came out with an EV. And so the guy and they had a flip phone. He had a flip phone with him. There's this company's flip phone too. And it's all those trifold, new things that Apple has now come out with and Huawei have come out with. But this company also had one. And he pulls it out and he shows me his new EV. I said, oh, let me see it. And it looked exactly like a Porsche Panamera, right? Exactly. And it was an EV for $30,000. And that's one. So again, if you think there's nothing there, there's certainly an unbelievable know-how to make things and to replicate what we do in the West. There was also a lunch that I had with one of our partners who's mainland Chinese, and we went to a guy who was the head of one of their large sort of sovereign wealth funds, and it acts as almost an alternative. He was acting in the role of heading up all the alternative investments, so allocating to private equity, credit, the whole up and down the capital stack. And very learned guy, had been his deputy. She had gone to Stanford, and he was educated somewhere in the West. So he also told me he was a Communist Party member. So he's not like a politician, but in order to be in the position that he had to seek approval from the party. And at the end of the lunch, it's one of these sort of elaborate Chinese, just very exquisite service, the whole thing lunch in this private room. And we were in this restaurant, and he asked me, he said, look, I'm going to have to walk out separately from you, and I need to leave before you because I can't really be seen with you. And because of my background in former, government, whatever it was. And so, yes, he's obviously, that showed me, he's clearly aware, not number one, that it wouldn't be well received because probably I didn't go through the right channels to get to a guy like him. Number two, the fact that they are that attentive. And believe me, if any of you have been there lately, you'll see every 100 yards on the streets of Beijing, there's cameras. This is a surveillance state. So yes, they are thinking the same thing, extremely concerned about us. And look, their economy right now is not doing well. So they got real concerns, I think, domestically. And after the party plenum, there's a real shift in direction in that country.
It's pretty amazing when you pause on it, because if you go back to, 2015, 16, 17, that world in there, they were the next super country. They had everything going for them, and then they've made seemingly a series of poor decisions, and then some problems are showing up. And now when you think about China 10 years from now, it's a kind of a big question mark.
Yeah, if you go back to those 3Ds, demography for them is a real problem. They're shrinking. I think there was an article not too long ago that talked about losing 10 million people.
Oh, it's a crazy number. It's something like, I think they're 1.3 billion now, and the 2100 estimate is 700 million. So it's like, it's crazy.
Yeah, it's that one China policy that they can't get out from under.
Steve, it worries me. It's time for China to do an acquisition. Well, they still can.
That would be a problem, right?
So one question for you on economics, and there's been a lot of talk in the election about tariffs, and tariffs are like 1930s tools, really. We've had them tucked away for a long, long time, and they're making a comeback. And it's just curious what you think about tariffs, because at some level, they are old school, and they're taxes, and they're all those problems. But on the other hand, if the Chinese are copying Panameras and making them in Mexico and trying to bring them across the border, or trying to sell them in Europe, maybe we need a tariff. So what do you think about tariffs?
Well, I consider myself a free trader. Again, thinking about, companies and investors and allowing capital to flow to, where the greatest return is what, we capitalists believe. But, there's not always an even playing field. So I don't think you can be absolute on that. And then when you listen to that debate the other night, not to dwell on that, there was agreement on tariffs too, especially having to do with China. So I do think there is something about trying to level the playing field, and the notion of a reciprocal tariff agreement is an interesting concept, because why shouldn't we? If it's good for them, then it should be good for us. And if China is going to sit there, and that is what's going on right now in so many of the industries, that there is so much state sponsorship and subsidy for these industries that they've got and manufacturing sectors, and they are concerned about making sure stability is in place in China and employment is there, that the end result is they've got way too much supply to meet the demand domestically, so they're dumping internationally. And I do think it's very much the case. If you think about, the downstream of this industry in the petrochemical space, I mean, that is clearly what's going on. And it's made for a really sloppy market, on the chemical space, when you've got sort of world scale facilities being built in China, and yet it goes back to the state imperative to keep people employed. So I do think we ought to think about it in a reciprocal way.
What do you think of? I was thinking about the World Trade Organization, but then you could extend it out to the World Health Organization, the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, all these types of organizations. What do you make of them as institutions right now? They seem to be, they are really showing up as volatile, is my impression. Like the debate at those places and the inability to have consensus or work together. What do you think of them?
It's like, not a lot of people that's a great question, because not a lot of people sort of stop to think about what do these multilateral organizations mean. And I know, and sort of my default when I'm asked something like that would be, well, these things are just, broken, and they have no mission anymore. We need to throw them all out. It'd be a great political answer just to be for that and say, make sure Turtle Bay in Manhattan is just removed. Meanwhile, you start to say that in New York City, they love that revenue that comes in from that big complex there, where UN Week starts next week. So, no, I think I had lunch with Ajay Banga about a month ago, and he's the new head of the World Bank. Now, this guy was CEO of MasterCard, right? So he really does understand how to drive a business. And he's come in with some real leadership and is trying to go and streamline that institution to rid that institution of this bureaucratic mindset. And that's what's happened in these institutions. I don't think that the mission they're about is necessarily the problem. It is the bureaucracy and the just sort of stasis that they have become. And I think it probably applies to all of them. WTO, WHO, they just don't function anymore.
Well, the World Bank comes up, not a lot, but when you start talking about energy in the developing world, it seems like the World Bank is they are the people there saying, no, we won't finance the natural gas pipeline. Like any sense of that issue or that thinking?
Right. I mean, again, and so when you think about China's influence on all these organizations, that brought me to another thing that was going on in Beijing last week. It was the Belt and Road Initiative African Summit. So they had most, if not all, of the African heads of state in Beijing. Traffic was a nightmare. Let's just set that aside. I missed a meeting because of it. But they do a good job in promoting sort of their development internationally. And, again, they don't have a democratic process, so they make a decision at the Politburo, and boom, they're out there. And they've got all these African states now tied up with Beijing on Beijing's terms, and so whatever it is that's advantage, right? And so Beijing's decided decarbonization and the green agenda is something that they're going to dominate in. I just suspect now the infiltration of this extreme position on the environment, which basically removes natural gas from the equation, is a result of a lot of that activity. And, we see it in Europe. You think about Europe right now, these 3Ds also really impact them. And I think what we're seeing, at least in the Moelis world in our European operation, is Europe is becoming aware at this point they're facing a conundrum because they've taken this decarbonization to heart and are way ahead, if you will, on realizing you got to figure out who's paying for this. And, if you think about sort of where they are in their energy outlook versus where we are, all I say is thank God for Texas, right?
I bet the crowd agrees with that one for sure. So as you were talking there, and I'm glad you brought up Europe, you painted this picture of China having some issues, but they've decided they're all in. Yep. They've looked at the world and said, we could make EVs, we're coming. They financially and otherwise are coming hard, right, with low prices and quality goods. And meanwhile, in the West, Europe, U.S., Canada, etc., we're going seemingly in the opposite direction. We've decided we're actually going to increase our costs and we're going to make some hard choices, but we're doing some things that could hurt our competitiveness. At the same time, they're doing some of the most predatory, if I could use that word, commercial things. So is that the right picture, or is that?
Well, right. It is. We are an anomaly globally on the energy transition.
Yeah.
Because so much of the progress that's made in our country has been the result of private sector innovation, right, and not necessarily government consensus, although there was for 2 years under the Biden administration, but it was only one-way street.
So maybe I could ask you, because you're so familiar with the complexities of Congress and government, and one of the issues that gets brought up, I think, in energy, if Trump were to win, is what would happen to the IRA, and it becomes a big debate. But you'll explain this to us better. But the IRA was passed under reconciliation. Yeah. So therefore, it just passed on a straight majority vote, and it wasn't a let's compromise, let's work together, let's find something that works, even if it's smaller. So my point is, what do you think happens to the IRA? But when you look back at how it was passed, and if we keep doing things like that, is that a problem we've got to stop?
So let me back up on that because there's a lot in that question.
There's a lot in there.
So, and forgive me, and where's the senator? Because she'll like embrace all this granularity.
She's waving.
In his process in the Senate.
She's having a flashback.
So, right. So reconciliation, let me just start there. This is a procedural mechanism that applies only to the United States Senate. The Senate operates on let's just say, generally speaking, for most matters, on a 60-vote threshold, which very rarely, although during the Obamacare debate for a time, the Senate had a 60-vote Democratic majority. Reconciliation is a process, and the reason why it's called that, it's not reconciling between the two houses. It's once a budget is passed, which is a very political document. The budget process is, like you would have in a business, you pass a budget and then you put the spending plan behind that budget. So 2 parts. So when a budget is passed and agreed upon between the two houses, and that only happens when you have unified government, it has to be one party in control, White House, House, Senate. When a budget passes, then you have to reconcile to that budget. That's why it's called reconciliation. So if you have unified party government, then you can employ this mechanism, which allows you in the Senate to lower the voting threshold to 51 to a simple majority. So at that point, then when you have a majority, and you're not going to have 60 at this point, you can pass things in the Senate just like the House operates, because in the House, it's always simple majority is absolute power. So that's why it was passed under reconciliation. And when I said it was a one-way street, it was only one party, the Democrats, that supported the IRA. There was no support for it on the Republican side. But this is not unique to the Biden administration or now. I mean, let me go back and just more generally speaking, since Clinton, when a new president is elected, not on a re-election, but when a new president is elected, has always been a majority in both houses that matches that president's party. So there's unified government since Clinton, and typically what happens is that unified government takes 2 years, and then all of a sudden the country wakes up because that party has been like bank robbers. They've gone in and done as much as they can and taken as much ground as they can legislatively, and the country realizes, oh my God, we need a check and balance. This is way too one-sided. And then the other party comes in to one of the houses, and the gears, grind and stop. And then for the rest of that presidency, then Obama was very famous for coming up with this saying, I've got a phone and a pen. And Congress, if you don't act and do what I want, which is what happens now in a divided Washington, I'll just pick up the phone and call the secretaries in my agencies, and I'll write an executive order and tell them what to do. Well, again, you get into the whole constitutional question of rules versus statutes and the whole thing. But that's what happens. So sorry to get off on that.
No, that was great.
Yeah. So that's a problem on the IRA. What you asked, what's going to happen? If there is unified Republican government, which means now Trump would have to win, Senate, which is very likely, Senator, I hope you'd agree with me, Senate, very likely we go Republican. Because it's basically 50-50 now with Joe Manchin, a very fossil fuel supporting Democratic senator, saying he's not running anymore. The state of West Virginia, very Republican. So that makes it 50-50 now, even going into this election. Most likely Montana will be a pickup for Republicans, maybe Ohio, maybe some others, but very close. If the Senate goes, the House is less sure, but it could go Republican. If that happens, then the reconciliation process will be afforded to the Republicans. Going back to what we said, it's tax year. It's fiscal Super Bowl year. So you've got to deal with that number one question. And the extension of the Trump tax cuts, it won't just be those tax cuts on the table. Every tax provision will be on the table for negotiation. Everything, corporate rates, capital gains, dividend rates, how we treat carried interest on private equity, all of it. So individual rates, most importantly. So I think the green subsidies are in real trouble going forward if it's a unified Republican majority.
Do you think of the bid-ask politically as you might have Harris, House Democrat, Senate's Republican? That would be one scenario. And the other scenario is all three Republican? Is that how you might frame it up?
I think so. I do.
So I've one question that's a lot of times in the regulatory world, this Supreme Court ruling on Chevron deference got people's attention, and I know most of you probably pretty familiar with it, but in a nutshell, you were talking about the power of the president and the power of the agencies. In a nutshell, well, first it's confusing for a lot of rules, but it seems to be putting pressure on agencies. They're not going to be able to do things that aren't specifically allowed, but it's going to put pressure on Congress to be very specific about what it is they're allowing. What do you think Chevron deference does to the mix of all of this?
Right. For the law students in here, I'm going to try and harken back to my law school days, which, believe me, very cloudy by now. It's the Chevron, it's the Loper-Bright case that overturned the Chevron doctrine. But it was also very clear they wanted to make sure they weren't creating too much of a precedent in that too. So it's very unclear about the standard of review for regulatory action by agencies, even after that case. So again, unclear. There was also there's several other cases that came down over the last year and a half too. One of them was a major questions doctrine, which I believe was a case was filed by one of the Republican attorneys general from West Virginia versus one of the Obama era, I think it was a Clean Power Plan, in which the court said if there's a major question under consideration, it is the Congress, as you say, the Congress's role. There were a couple of other cases that bear on agency action. One is which there was like the independent agencies like the FTC, SEC, FCC, they have tribunals within the agencies that the regulant has to avail itself of before they can get into court. The court struck that down, said that's not fair. You don't go to the in-house, tribunal because no, you get to go to an unbiased court. And then there was another one about the tolling of a statute of limitations and when a regulant could file a lawsuit against the government if it was harmed by a particular regulation. All those together, because then the statute now, the court came down and says, no, it doesn't toll upon passage of the rule. It tolls upon the harm that the regulant experiences. So obviously now this will precipitate a lot more challenge of regulatory action. So I do think you are going to have regulators much more hesitant to be aggressive. But I think the other part of your question is, what about Congress? Will it now step up and do what it has to do? I'm not as confident there because I just think that because of this divide and the lack of consensus and the inability to legislate right now, very, very hard to have bipartisan product. And going back to the original question about the IRA, how do things get passed? You can't do those kind of things on a simple majority. Typically, if they don't involve revenues, indebtedness, or entitlement spending, you can't even avail yourself of the lower voting threshold in the Senate. So it'll be a tough sledding for a while.
Okay, this is the 13-minute warning. There's a little QR code there if you would like to submit a question. We'd love to hear from any of you with thoughts, but I'm going to go to a completely different topic because it'd be a shame if we didn't grab you on this one. The conflict in Ukraine, the conflict in the Mideast, just the fact that we have two open conflicts without any kind of clear resolution in sight. It's not clear how it will end. And you have people lined up on both sides of those things that we really don't want them in direct conflict. What are your thoughts on how serious these things are for the broader implications of them? What could we be doing to stop them, to end them, but still be true to what the principles and our allies? How are you thinking about those two conflicts?
I know the senator could be a great source on, especially the Russia Ukraine, as she was ambassador to NATO. But my opinion is like we have just not been about sort of a strategic basis upon which to have a policy for Ukraine. And what is it that we're really trying to do? Because if the objective that we're after in Ukraine is we want Ukraine to win, we're not doing that. We are not putting Ukraine in a position. All of what you've read in the news about the difficulty in accessing weaponry, all of the rules of engagement we put on Zelensky, maybe some would say, well, maybe they could never win anyway, given the size of the military they're up against in Russia and given what Putin's got behind him and a nuclear arsenal and the rest. Maybe it was impossible to begin with. But again, that goes back to the notion that we really should be having a strategic basis upon which to act and know what object we are trying to achieve. And I just don't think we've done that.
Can I ask you, it almost looks like the objective is we don't want I'm talking about the current administration, we don't want the Russians to win. Don't really want the Ukrainians to win either, because so we kind of want them to just be hitting each other. I don't know, but about how do you end something like that?
Right, it's not. That's not an observation that's too off mark, because that's sort of where I think things are going to head. I think we get to a stalemate in that conflict, because I don't think there'll be truce. Putin's not giving up. Zelensky politically has an inability. I mean, how could he, though, back off at this point? And if the goal is, again, what is the strategic objective here? If the goal is to put Zelensky in the best possible negotiating position to then bring about a negotiated stalemate, then let's admit that and do that. I just think the American people, and all the polling on this issue, the American people are behind what the effort of us saying we're with NATO, we want to defend, Ukraine. But the intensity in that polling and the priority placed on that issue is not there. So I'm not sure that the populace here is one way or the other that wed. As you heard, Trump is, and J.D. Vance for sure taking a position, this thing's done before they even get into office, if that were the case. And you just don't hear it from Harris. I mean, who knows?
Do you think Putin, a lot of the rhetoric around supporting Ukraine was often around, hey, this is step one, Putin wants to go to the Baltics, he'll be in Poland, he wants to rebuild the Soviet Union. There was this storyline around his intentions. Do you think that was the correct one, or was that exaggerated?
Again, that storyline sort of emanated from I think the real, if you read a lot of the literature and the books that have been written around the end and the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the engagement that our country had with in Bush 41 about that whole issue, it was, I think, more likely the misunderstanding of the communication between what Putin took away from, hey, the U.S., said that they would do X, Y, Z. They didn't do it. Then he decided, well, I'm going to go violate international law and reclaim sovereignty, all that stuff. So, look, I don't know. I mean, Maynard, I don't know if I think Putin wants to take over the world. I sure think he would like to. But is he going to take the Baltics? If I were the Baltics, I'd sit there and be really worried about that, and would want the United States to be there with them, because we operate on the rule of law. And the law is these are sovereign countries. So if there's a fear, we ought to be there to trying to address that. I don't know what the answer is to whether he would really do that or not.
We were talking about the volatility in the world, and the next unexpected event, is it China and Taiwan? One you wonder about is Putin's own political footing, and this is an unpopular war. Although it's crazy, I hear Russian families get paid when a son or daughter dies in the conflict, and so it's almost an industry. Do you think could we wake up and Putin's no longer in power? I mean, any sense of that?
I just think he controls way too much, and to me, it's a military state, and I don't, if he ever allows any weakness, he's gone. So no, I don't think that right now.
So on our geopolitical tour, this is why it's so fun to visit with Eric, because you can just go anywhere, because he sees so much. Venezuela, you mentioned all the elections. That's an important energy province, and it's right in our backyard. It's pretty amazing what just happened there, including the president declaring Christmas is now in October. But what do you make of that situation? Should we have been more forceful there? Or it's just a crazy thing, and it's right in our backyard, and it has to do with energy and the whole energy ecosystem.
Amazing, and I've on planes a lot, so I either read a book or I listen to it on AirPods and on my iPad. And I just finished John Bolton's book, In the Room, Where It Happened, or Room Where It Happened, it's called. And obviously, he has an axe to grind with President Trump, but he is really knowledgeable about a lot of things, international affairs. And he talks about when Guaido and the whole thing happened a few years ago. And my takeaway from that goes back to this sort of lack of, a strategic plan and a lack of consensus on what was the objective we were trying to achieve. And, I think my view of how he describes that happening and failing was you had so many individuals vested in that situation in Washington, in the bureaucracy in the State Department, that they were working against any kind of aggressive move that we wanted to take to try and promote democracy there, that we failed. And I think lately, in the latest, when the opposition leader flew to Spain, right, he got out of there. I mean, I think it's, again, the lack of priority that Washington's placing on something like that. I don't know what the answer is, other than we got to sort of clean out a lot in D.C. And it's hard. It's hard to be a superpower. It's not easy. And again, going back to the tension in our country, when you don't really have the people of this country saying, yes, go in and let's all make a stand in Caracas. Like, I think 90% of the country has no idea where Caracas is. So, and it's no fault of theirs. Why should they? So, again, it's just hard, and I just blame that on, our apparatus and our State Department and others who've just deprioritized that.
Okay, so we're a nonpartisan crowd, bipartisan crowd, but you mentioned this parallel to the 70s, right? And inflation and conflict and all those issues. The Reagan movie is out. And, like him or not like him, whatever your politics are, it was a dramatic change because you had a leader with strong views. Have you seen the movie? What do you reflect on that era? And is it possible, whatever the political stripes are of the person, is it possible that we get that kind of thing again in American politics?
So, no, I've not seen the movie. I want to. But look, I sort of came of age as a kid with Reagan. That was how sort of, again, I'm from Richmond, Virginia, and my folks were, back then, the state was beginning to turn Republican, and they were very involved on a grassroots level in the party to try and elect Republican candidates to the county boards and the congressional level, Senate. And to me, he did, it's sort of this Reagan-Bush Republican that I would say is somebody who I am. And it's a real belief in America.
Is that just a Republican with manners? Is that the way to think of that, or are there deeper?
I do think it's a commitment to upward mobility, that it's about opportunity in our country. It's interesting how Harris has come out with that, forget what she calls it, like a plan of opportunity or something. But it is about equal opportunity in this country, not equal outcomes. And to me, that is, it's based on the founding documents again. It's the pursuit of happiness. No one guaranteed, the new definition of what equity means, right? And this is when you get into the discussion on DEI. This insertion of equity in diversity and inclusion, because we are about a diverse society. We are about including everyone in the American dream. But when you insert this new definition of equity, to me, that suggests that government is going to be empowered to somehow decide what's fair, what's not fair. And life's not fair, right? But all we are guaranteed in this country as Americans is we should all have equal opportunity. And so I think the focus on that is what Reagan was about. And so you ask, are we ever going to have that again? I hope. I'm an optimist. I think anywhere in the world that you're going to have opportunity, it will be here. And, there's a reason why people are storming the border, because they want to get here, right? Because we are that. We still are, regardless of all the noise around.
So we're wrapping up. A minute left. Think about your own future. You've been at Moelis now 10 years.
Just like KBH Center.
Yeah, it's all about 10 years right now. So your next 10 years, what are the things on your radar personally that you hope to do, might want to do, et cetera?
Look, I'm, like Steve, I feel very privileged to be at Moelis. We're a great entrepreneurial investment bank, very unique on Wall Street because it was one of the first, not the first, one of the first sort of independents that, and probably one of the last that were sort of created and now public. I think we do great things for investors and for companies. And so it's very exciting. And I always say, as a former, politician for so long, almost a quarter of a century, to be able to practice what I preach, because I am a real advocate of the private sector. So hopefully I've got a future in this sort of intersection, because you can tell I'm so very passionate about our country. And what it does for the likes of all of you here and the future that you're going to have. I'm very bullish for your opportunity out there, because no matter what you choose to do, and I love the sort of interdisciplinary nature of the KBH Center, that you've got engineering and geoscience and law and business all together, because that is so true. And sort of the ability to open your aperture like that when you are here is going to really set you off and having a great future. So again, congratulations for making it here, because it wasn't easy. I know, I got kids, and just good luck to you. And yeah, I hope to be still a part of the public debate in whatever way. So.
Well, Eric, huge thank you to you for coming and the range of things you can cover. This is why it's so fun to visit with you. Can I get a big round of applause for Eric?
Thank you.